Welcome to the Scholarship Teaching and Learning podcast. I'm Phil Martin.
Hi, I'm Lucy Turner-Oakes.
And we're joined today by Jane Pritchard. Jane, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you very much, Phil.
We're going to pick your expertise on quite a range of topics today, and you've got. But please feel free to. I didn't actually prep in terms of getting through all your areas of expertise. So please feel free to say I don't know to any of these things.
Yes, excellent.
Could we start just by giving your background, what's your interest in the scholarship teaching and learning? And just to define our acronyms here, we usually talk to this as SoTL. So anyone new coming to this, SoTL is the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. So can you tell us a bit about how you're interested and involved in this and what your definition?
Okay, thanks. My background is actually, I'm a material scientist and engineer. So that was my 20th century role. And in the 21st century, I sort of moved into educational development, supporting people in teaching and learning. So I guess my interest in SoTL came from a role I had at the University of Glasgow, supporting colleagues who are on teaching and scholarship contracts to really think about what scholarship meant in their context, to help the institution articulate it for promotion criteria. But personally for me, because I think it's utterly a responsibility of individuals and institutions to have evidence-based, evidence-informed educational enhancement. So I actually think it's absolutely right at research intensives particularly that we think about scholarly information developed for enhancing our practice.
So where are we at the moment with scholarly teaching? What do we know about good teaching practice and how has it developed over, I guess, the last 20, 30 years?
Time frame?
Well, I think we've in previous episodes, we've sort of landmarked early 90s as being a key point in the development of scholarship teaching and learning.
Jane was mentioning
but...
Boyer earlier, weren't you? And the relationship between people in UK and that being a sort of starting point of places.
It was. I mean, the Ernest Boyer kind of scholarship reconsidered, 1990, 91, I couldn't quite get my date, was kind of the start of the conversation about what is it that academics do at different points in their kind of careers or roles or interests. And I think the UK kind of started to pick up on it in the late 90s, early 2000s. And we have taken a slightly different approach to it in the UK. We're slightly, perhaps a broader definition. And I've often tried to stay away from definitions of scholarship, teaching and learning per se, but I think that's where it kind of stems from. And I think, for me, it's really about helping people to articulate what it is their intention is in developing teaching and learning. So for me, it's quite an intentional activity. Purposeful is often the phrase I use to talk about SoTL. It certainly has evolved, and I think it's evolved away from being individual practitioners in their classroom doing some action research and before and after, into more systemic, more institutional kind of strategic work. And I think that's a good development.
It kind of, we were talking earlier, it's about that sort of community of practice, and also that it's not owned by one individual or one particular institution or place, but if we're going to make it meaningful, it's got to be broader scale than that, hasn't it? And so do you feel like those networks the networks that came, I guess, in that sort of late 90s, early 2000s have laid good ground on that? Does it feel like a different landscape in the UK? And
I think if you go to things like the International Society, the SoTL conference, it's a great conference to go to if you get the opportunity.
I'm going to go this year.
I'm going.
Oh, you?
I'm
Brilliant.
So, yeah. But I think it's a really rich place to hear from people outside your subject. And that's the one thing I think that SoTL is in danger of doing, is becoming too subject-based. And so it's finding place for peers in subjects to talk with each other, so chemists to talk to other chemistry educators, but making sure chemists are talking to historians who are talking to classicists.
And why is it that feels so important?
Because I think most teaching and learning things are shared. Yeah. Shared issues, shared questions, shared answers, and we sometimes think everything is very subject-specific.
Okay, so it's a shared thing, and we don't want to restrict ourselves basically to...
I think there's probably more that we can learn across equally. I think it's equally as valid for talking with colleagues across the subjects as well as within a subject.
I have to say, coming from a disciplinary background to SoTL, that openness we talked earlier about porousness of SoTL is really important and really generative, because otherwise you do get stuck and you kind of tend to feel like, I don't know, you're missing that wider picture. And we might touch on it again and don't want to go too big scale, but a university is a place where disciplines work in a shared space, don't they? And that's part of a higher education that's different to, I don't know, a think tank or something quite small scale and disciplinary specific. There's a benefit there, and also learners are in that bigger environment, so we should use that wider lens maybe.
Oh, I think so, absolutely. I think it's learning is socially constructed, socially situated. And why do we try and resolve learning and teaching problems in pockets? Seems an anomaly to me.
Yeah.
So I asked you a bit of an unfair question earlier about like summarising the last 30 years of SoTL. So yeah, I mean, I'm interested to know what's happening at the moment within the field of teaching and learning generally. What's kind of trending? What are people doing? What's interesting research that's quite current? Some of this might be post-pandemic, and this was going to be a later question, which feel free to park or jump in on. But is there anything that's happened since the experience of moving online and things? Have we learned anything? And is this an area that's really influenced what's happening at the moment in terms of what research is being carried out in SoTL?
Yeah, you're certainly seeing flavours of that, aren't you? If you read around, you're seeing a lot of people talking about how institutions are deciding whether to kind of stay more online, hybrid, blended, and all that kind of conversations happening. How we support students to learn in different ways, how we support teachers to teach in different ways, assess in different ways. I think it's opened up conversations, certainly in some institutions we would never have been able to have without the immediacy or the need to respond. But I think there's a lot of potential to ask some different questions. I think there's a danger slightly in the research to see some things we're doing as because of the pandemic, but they were already things that were already there around supporting students developing academic skills. There were hidden barriers to students being able to participate fully in higher education, which have been exposed more by the pandemic. I want to make sure that we're not using the pandemic as the kind of fall guy, if you like, for the reasons we should be doing it. We should perhaps always be asking tricky questions about, have we actually got a fair access to students engaging in higher education?
So you were both talking about, just before we started recording, you were talking about the importance of evidence-based approaches to teaching, which a few would argue with, I think. So have we got, where is the research at in terms of these kinds of things that we're talking about? Have we got any notable studies that have come out of scholarship teaching and learning generally that have sort of shaped our thinking in terms of what works and what doesn't in learning?
That's an interesting question to frame it, because actually I've been sort of staying away from the what works and what doesn't work, because I think that's in some ways in helping people understand learning and teaching and the role that scholarship teaching and learning can play, is that there is no definitive paper that's going to pick up and put down and say that's why you should use educational recordings to support students' learning. We tend to build a picture of lots of bits of the puzzle. So I think it's quite tricky to sell that to people who are looking for an answer when it's complex. I haven't seen things recently which I would say were earth-shattering. There's lots of good work going on. I see it a lot on Twitter, the papers. There's a lot going on around AI. I think there's scope there to be for more criticality. We're taking a position in a lot of institutions where AI is a good thing. How can we live with it? How can we embrace it? But let's just check in about that and see how it does support students' learning and what it stops.
It was interesting. My colleague Maeve was talking about, she's quite techie, and she looked at a study which was about use of Google Maps and kind of how great and useful that is, but also how it's getting rid of functions that might be quite helpful for people about orienting using different signs or engaging with your environment in different ways. So it's just a sort of, it's what we were talking about earlier as well, isn't it? It's the pause around assumptions, as well as this is an interesting topic, there's a new innovation, we want to look at this, but we kind of need to look at our frame for that first, don't we? And maybe ask about, sort of deeper questions about educational assumptions.
It's assumed good, isn't it? That's what you're talking about. It's new, it's shiny. What are the benefits? And it's great to start from that. So it's a very appreciative inquiry approach. What are the benefits? But it's also just slightly pausing and saying, there may be some loss here. Let's just check in, about this. Are we absolutely sure that if students don't handwrite anymore, is something lost? And, people talk about in academic literacy, the physicality of writing can help a thinking process. So how are we supporting students to see writing as a process, not a product? And all we're rewarding is product.
Well, that's interesting. Is there a particular study on that talked about the importance of handwriting? Is there
not handwriting per se, but we're not talking about it. But we all know that when we write things down, and if you've been through school in, well, certainly the last century, you did it, and writing caused you to slow down and think. And there's a process. Have we lost something by going straight to typed? No one's asking that
Interesting, yeah.
question.
So I think, and we've talked about this quite a lot already today, about asking those questions, which maybe are more difficult questions. And I suppose my question to you about that is then, how would we, I'm really interested in stuff like that, but how would I then build a study to look at that? And what would be my starting point on, not necessarily that specifically, but I suppose, is it read around that first, or is it start with observation, or?
A bit of both, isn't it?
Yeah.
I don't think it's that there's a place to start, apart from make sure you do both things. Is,
Yeah.
you know, what are your kind of hypothesis or
Yeah.
your working kind of idea is, you know, does handwriting help students to develop ideas equally as well as typing, or is there something else happening? Read around, find out if this has been solved before, somebody else has looked at it. Have they looked at it in your disciplinary subject context?
Yeah.
You know, is there something physical about writing out chemical equations? Is there something physical about writing out maths? You can't imagine people who didn't long handwrite
It's a chalk and
mathematical
talk, isn't
solutions.
it? Yeah.
Then they'll say it's the process of thinking. If that went all online, are we missing something? And I think mathematicians would argue you need to do it longhand.
So I think that's interesting and definitely a direction that I think is worth talking about here, because the main question I had was thinking of people who want to start their own scholarship teaching learning project, and they're involved in teaching, but they don't quite know where to start. Lucy, you probably deal with this a lot with your SoTL module and people looking for research projects. What's a valid questions to be asking at the moment? And I guess these kinds of things are going to be coming up a lot with this pace at which learning technology moves, and it seems to be picking up pace. Every year there's just a new way of either presenting information, interacting in lectures, the mix of how hybrid learning is presented, the new tools that we've got. And at each point, you need to stop and ask, is there a trade-off here? This is something cool that we couldn't do before, but are we losing something? So the sheer volume of opportunity right now might be a bit overwhelming for people. What advice would you give?
Anymore, though? I mean, sorry, but it's just that I think we have this feeling, pace of change isn't that faster now than. But I've been in this job all this century, and I've heard that every year. So it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it? The pace of change is, and one thing you're certain of, change is your constant. I think we use it as potentially a defence mechanism about why we shouldn't do things, rather than change is great. Let's embrace it. And we want, how do we do this? And seeing it as an opportunity to ask good questions, seeing it as an opportunity to ask new questions. And I've kind of come round a bit thinking differently about change. Yeah.
Coming back to the getting started bit, not being overwhelmed and actually managing to get something that has traction to kind of build an inquiry on. The thing that struck me about what you said about the sort of handwriting thing, or the conversations we were having earlier, is that it does come from people's practice, or at least in my thinking, scholarship should come in part from your experience as a teacher and a learner. That's somebody learning about teaching, basically. And you talked a bit about sort of transforming something from the heart or the initial sort of sense impressions to then an inquiry. I think that's quite important, actually, because to me that feels like quite a distinguishing characteristic of scholarship of teaching and learning, that it starts with an experience, maybe. Or how does that figure in the inquiry?
It does, because it's mostly when people kind of say, I don't know what to, like,
where do I start?
Where do I start? What do I investigate? They normally had an experience, perhaps they taught something last year which went particularly well or didn't go particularly well. And I often use group work. People say, I tried that group work thing, my students didn't like it and I'm not doing it again. Well, no researcher in their good mind would kind of walk away from that without thinking, why didn't it work? I'm not surely the first person who's done group work. How can I make it better? And, what were the kind of sticky points? You'd go away and inquire into it. You try and make sure you're not falling down the same potholes everyone else has fallen down. So you do some reading around, get some good practice, but be sure it's actually group work is what you want your students to do. And making sure your intention is there. So sometimes it's a good and a bad experience that drives the kind of inquiry. And the difference between what I call scholarly teaching and kind of good practice and what everyone should be doing is, making sure they've got a bit of context to what their practice, and SoTL for me is the purposeful transition of an experience or an interest in a topic into a deliberate inquiry. You're setting out and you're thinking about ethics. You're thinking about the power dynamics between you and your learners. You're thinking about creating a robust, rigorous, trustworthy investigation. but also you're thinking about something that's manageable in your time. I think, and you might think, I think most people start off with PhD's worth of questions.
Yeah.
And they've got 10 weeks to do something.
How scholarly is teaching in higher education? Sorry, another massively sweet question. So feel free to
I want to come back to in there in a little bit.
One of the things that I was as you were talking, I meant to ask earlier. One of my first questions was just the importance of, perhaps before you embark on your own SoTL project, the importance of becoming a scholarly teacher yourself first, and kind of utilizing a lot of the research and evidence-based practice into your own teaching. And we've got things like the PG Cap here and various teaching courses, so presumably we're trying to make teaching as scholarly as possible. Do you think we're in a good place generally in higher education? Is teaching generally as scholarly as it should be? And kind of connected to that, I think, would you agree that it's kind of a good place to start before you get into your own SoTL project? Just thinking of people who might be coming from, again, their own discipline, their own research background, and perhaps haven't absorbed as much of the literature on scholarship for teaching and learning as dedicated teachers, perhaps.
It's a massive question, you're right.
Isn't that back to read again? Which is what
it's
you
back
kind
to
of
read.
started off with.
Yeah, I guess. I don't really care. I mean, it's to be blunt, but it's just like, you need to have some experience to talk about or think about. Whether or not you've read a lot of literature about teaching and learning, might not be. I don't think you always have to do it before you embark on your teaching or scholarly teaching. But I think you certainly should be starting to think about whether or not this is the right thing to do. I don't see teaching as a craft. I know some people do. I see it as something that people can learn to do and learn to do better. And I think that reading has its place to play. But
why do you say you don't see it as a craft? That's interesting.
Because it suggests some people can do it and some people can't.
Okay. Oh, I would see it as a different analogy that you would do your apprenticeship again with the, I'm not going to say master crafts person, but
But I guess sometimes in crafts, there's a sense that sometimes your mentor might be, or your master might be shaping you in their image.
Right. Yeah.
And you learn the craft that way. And I think that the important bit is to enable people to sometimes challenge some of the practices, because their tradition isn't always good practice.
Yeah.
And slightly kind of breaking that up.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the motivation behind the question, really, because I think teaching, based on my own observations, I've seen a lot of people who are very tradition-based in their teaching, and they have cherished beliefs like that might not be borne out in the literature, for example. And I take your point, the reading is not everything, but how much of a problem is kind of entrenched personal ways of teaching in higher education, or how many times have you seen it? You know, there are things that the concepts that you could become familiar with that would help. It just looks like they haven't updated their teaching in a long time.
Yeah, I think it's coming back to something Lucy was saying. I think that the role of SoTL for me is to connect heart and head. No one goes in to deliberately give a bad lecture or a bad seminar or design a poor assessment. No one has the intention of doing that. But there's a lot of feelings and belief around what good looks like in teaching. And I think if we left it there, we'd be doing a disservice to ourselves as professionals, and we'd be doing a disservice to our students. And I think for me, the SoTL bit is connecting the head back into that. So what makes you feel that students don't like engaging or asking questions of each other? What makes you feel that students do that? And they are feelings. And a good bit of SoTL is to start actually sometimes, what feelings do you have about learning and teaching? What makes good in learning and teaching in your subject? It's important to me that students do 50 titrations in order to learn titration in chemistry. Is that true? Do I really need to do 50 or do I need to do 10? And I think for me, there's a lot of heart, and I don't think sometimes that's moved on, but I think there's opportunities through things like recognition schemes, through kind of PG caps for particularly early career, but I think for more established staff, to take the moment to stock take about what they do and how it supports learning, to provide a framing of why their feelings about learning teaching are good, and then to hang the scholarship off that.
It's the intentional bit again, isn't it, as well, and and discipline, actually, a disciplined analysis of that feeling and the assumptions behind it, and then thinking about how are you going to ask that question and what will be the sort of method that will enable you to kind of get to the end of that inquiry. But
beliefs
the
and
pause.
feelings are two different things as well.
Yeah.
You talked about beliefs. It's like people have a belief that it's really important that teachers, we have a belief that, if it's anonymously marked, we'll be more robust. But actually, we should have some professionalism that we should still be able to look at who the candidate is. We've got good assessment criteria and protocols, and we can give some personalised feedback to that student. So we've got these contradictions. So we know that this stuff can happen, but we have this kind of belief that anonymity creates a more rigorous system. I don't think that's true. PhD Viva is the least anonymous experience out. But no one questions the validity of that.
No, I think that's really interesting. And it's something we were talking about again earlier, is particularly around PhD education. And that's an area of scholarship I'd really like to see more of. It feels to me like it's been the second coming, the stuff on postgraduate or PhD.
There's good stuff in Australia. I mean,
Is there?
Australia for a
Okay.
long time. I mean, when I started out, I suppose my first, if you like, technically formal SoTL project was around PhD supervision
Okay.
and what happens in the meeting between the supervisor and supervisee, and that sort of negotiated space. Which kind of, there was a load of really interesting stuff around research supervision, conceptions of supervision, trading, bartering, crafts, master, apprentice kind of models. But PhD supervision is the last place we go to talk about developing practice. You're right. We're quite happy to talk about developing a lecture or a seminar or a lab, but we don't talk about supervision because that's research and that's not teaching. There's loads of great stuff out there.
Okay.
We will look it up and make some lists of it later.
We had some prepared questions. I think, Lucy, have we made any inroads into these?
You have to say, have I answered your questions?
Yeah, my questions were mainly around, and as somebody who is quite interested in how minds work and how we absorb information, and looking at a bit of like debunking of popular, because I agree, I like your example about the anonymity and marking. It's one of those things that you just think, why are we doing it this way? And I think universities are, because of their size, this happens a lot in universities. You get entrenched practice, and they are in many ways quite conservative institutions. It's very difficult to instigate change. And I tend to see a lot of things which to my eye, should be reviewed. And I end up asking, why are we doing things like this? And you often get the question, well, we just do, don't we? And it is about kind of inquiring that and pushing it. But it is hard in universities because we're looking for scholarly informed teaching. We should be open to saying, we're doing things like this, but I can't see any evidence that this is an effective method, and things should be open to change. But it sometimes feels harder than that, harder than it should be sometimes to.
But do you think there's a lot of myth busting? So people in educational development, I think we're often doing a lot of myth busting. The institution won't allow us. And we're like, is that true? But also I think we encourage, we talk about innovation a lot sometimes in teaching and learning, which suggests it's shiny and new. Sometimes we forget to go back, and I think as you're saying, to ask some really kind of fundamental questions about our proposition, our offer. Have we got some of the building blocks right in the first place?
Yeah.
Can we challenge that? And we're looking at the latest use of VR or AI, and they're great and valid questions, but we kind of skirt over what I'd call foundational aspects of the teaching and learning experience. And I think we need to keep revisiting them to check in that they're right for now at this stage in 2023. Is it right we still have anonymous marking? Is it right that we still...
Is it?
Yeah. I don't know. I think it's an assumed rigor. And I think, we know there's bias in marking, if people know, but I think then we say feedback is better when it's more personal. So these two things can't, these are contradictory.
They don't work together,
pieces of data, aren't they?
Yeah.
But it's very testable. We can see.
But people don't want to ask it. It's because there's a feeling of done and dusted.
Yeah.
And I think we should be going back and asking some questions. Really ask the question about really what is the purpose of a timed exam assessment in most subjects? And if the answer is because it prevents cheating, they can't use AI, then I think we're doing a disservice to our learners and a disservice to our academics in designing great assessment tasks that are more realistic for their subject. I think we're still not questioning some real fundamental practices around timed exams.
You talked earlier about an example of a kind of more shiny word coming up, innovative assessment, where learners, instead of doing that, were producing, was it a podcast or something else?
It's a radio script.
A radio script for two different audiences. And that was really interesting to me because it highlighted, I suppose, a meaningful sense of assessment and a kind of a sense of what is it for, being not about a performance, but about getting them to think about something differently. And I suppose, I don't know where I'm going with this, but that was just, it was an interesting way.
It's a sense of what the purpose of the higher education is, though.
Yeah.
So and it's like a contract, isn't it? So when we're asking kind of inquiry questions, you could say, we're designing assessment tasks that help the student to tell us what we've told them. And that feels like a real shortcoming of higher education. We should be thinking about how we're supporting students through our teaching and assessments to really tackle really conceptually difficult things. And you should want actually sometimes the feedback from your students to be, that was really hard, I had to really think. Not that, thank you very much, I feel very supported. It's, they want some real kind of conceptually difficult topics and trickiness, but also that the demonstration of the learning isn't just a private practice to the lecturers. It's got some public outgoing. It's got some sense of, can you take this learning and translate it into different audiences? If you really want your students to write for different audiences and communicate as part of your graduate attributes, your transferable outcomes, don't get them just to write you essays in a closed book exam. Get them to do those kinds of tasks.
So I'm really pleased you said all those things because it's leading me to this idea of York at the moment very self-consciously promoting itself as a university of public good. And maybe we can talk a bit about where and how scholarship of learning and teaching can kind of fit into that. Because it must be about that sharing, in a sense, sharing sort of our thinking with learners, but also building assessments which enable learners to take that impact back out. I mean, do you see what scope, how can we use this public good sort of byline to really argue for the place of scholarship in an institution like ours? No pressure, Jane.
No, but crikey, yeah, it's only a university mandate, isn't it? Crikey.
And we haven't sorted it out ourselves yet as an institution.
So ask the question then. I'll get everyone else to answer. It's not about coming up with a definition, I would say. I'd almost stay away from a definition. It's like, what does it mean to talk about public good in chemistry? So, you see a lot of things around citizen science and stuff. So students are out there, like a colleague in Bristol used to get students to work with the council to do monitoring. So they learnt about doing very real projects with very real data that inform the council about air quality. I mean, that's good. So it's kind of a live, lived experience, isn't it? But getting students to write about something highly theoretical to prove to Phil and Lucy that I know something about air quality testing and chemistry. Maybe they both got their place, but it certainly shouldn't just be the latter.
Yeah. So it's something about it's not only the what, but the what next.
Yeah.
I mean, you do need that. We need learners to come out with those knowledge attributes, don't we? But I hate the way you speak in this now after a while. But we also need to know what they're going to do with it, and is it meaningful for them? And
it might not always be kind of like pragmatic or practical. And I think that's one of the slightly things is that people say, well, like the maths at school argument. So why do students need to learn some of the maths they learn at school? It's because it teaches logic and thinking, and we need to be careful not to lose that as well. There's a reason to kind of grapple some theory because we start to think about other things differently. It's not everything has to be sort of transactional and useful. But there is an element where probably more of our assessments should show some externality. I would say.
So really well said, I think. So it's not an either or, but about emphasis. And
it's an and for me.
Yeah.
Do you think higher education is slightly too assessment focused?
I don't think it's assessment focused enough.
Controversial.
Yeah, controversial. Come on. I guess, why do you say that?
Because it feels like is this ever-present concern of, are we doing enough to prepare students for assessments? And listening to conversations recently kind of triggered by the artificial intelligence context about assessments needing to be realistic representations of things that students will do in the future. And we just seem to be the conversation is kind of kludging around assessment a lot rather than what we're actually teaching them. So the content of the course. And I know everything should be aligned, but it just seems recent conversations seems to always lead back to assessment. Is that something you've noticed, or would you?
I I guess it's become a bit adversarial though for me. It's like teaching versus assessment. It's like content versus that thing we need to do. And assessment's it's starting to feel to me like this sort of necessary evil. Institutions talk about it, or when we have to assess them in order to give the degree. I think we should be seeing assessment as the kind of...
It's a driver.
It's a driver, yeah.
I mean, it does drive learning. There's lots of research that says it does do that, isn't there?
But if you're finding your assessment is driving bizarre or perverse behaviours in learners, then change your assessment. Yeah, it's change. I think embrace it. I think it's... If you see assessment as just students telling you how much they remember of your really engaging lecture, then there's no point to that. If you see assessment as being challenged by AI because you put the question into the AI and it gives a really good answer, then stop asking that question, because the student can do that. That's not higher education. Higher education is knowing whether the answer is valid, useful, insightful, what they can do with it. I think I'd like to see a return to thinking more about assessment as being something to be positive about, and the teaching is to provide students the conditions to think, really think, and assessments to require students to really think and not just be remembering lots of information and preferencing certain types of learners. We don't create a condition where actually students are... Sorry, I've opened a can here. No. But there is a sense that I think we sometimes have really innovative teaching. We can do PBL, problem-based learning, and we can do voting and colouring in and all these kind of exciting teaching. And then we come back to really traditional assessment. And I think higher education's missed a trick in creating students who can demonstrate their knowledge, their skills, their attributes holistically in a variety of ways. And actually all students should be able to do that, not just some students. So actually challenging them to be able to communicate, to write for different audiences, to visually represent their information.
Yeah,
that's
sounds great
education.
to me. Yeah.
You've talked about that in your practices. Phil and I both share a kind of bit of academic skills and writing support background. And you've talked about using different genres of writing with learners, haven't you, before?
Yeah.
Didn't you do some scholarship on that, or were you just...
Oh,
you're
no,
you're looking really nervous now.
I think
I was thinking, did I? Was that another film?
I was just dreamt it. I think everything you're saying is totally valid about looking at different ways of expression. I think there is just observationally again, there seems to be a shift away from just relying on essays that regurgitate what students were taught in lectures. I'm not sure that's... I don't see that a lot. And I think most of when I look at module specs and program specs, I mean, you look at the learning outcomes, they tend to be fairly, based around deep learning. I don't see too many that over-rely on rote memorization of knowledge chunks. And so I think you sort of see that in assessments, and I see some interesting assessments coming out, like a lot of video blogs and using different media as range of expression, different genres of writing. I think that's it's happening, and whether it answers the questions of whether they're preparing students sufficiently for what they're going to be doing in the future, I think is open to question.
But I suppose no one sets out in their outcomes to say they're looking for knowledge and remembering. So I think that's slightly the disconnect for me. It's no one states that, but at the end of the day, it's very hard for a timed condition assessment not to be actually looking for that quality in a student. So the intention will be that this is deep learning, we're asking these tricky questions. But the reality is the students who can recall seeing similar types of answers before will do better. So there's very little I would call new thinking in situ happening in those conditions, but the stated outcomes look deep and the assessment looks like it's that, but the behaviour required by the student is probably more of a strategic approach.
We should be looking for some sort of transferability. Is that fair to say? I mean, yes, we need you to demonstrate that you have learned particular things for sure, but it's doing that in a way that's not purely rote, and there should be some element of problem solving going on in assessments.
Yeah, thinking. I think it's proper thinking. It's not, in some sense, it's not playing a game. I think a lot of assessments can feel like game playing for students. Yeah, and it's I kind of liken it in terms of like you two might have played a lot of Monopoly and board games at school, and you come to university and you find out the game is Cluedo. You don't know the rules, but you've got an idea of the feeling of that. So you kind of, okay, I know I've got to roll a dice, I've got to get around. And for some students, they've never played any board games, and no one's helping them to unpack that kind of tacit understanding about what is required in assessments. And they've only ever played cards. And somehow these students are kind of disadvantaged by the system, but they don't know they are.
Mm.
And, and there's a sense of, well, that you're not the right type of student, or, you should know what it means to be at university. You should know that Cluedo's like Monopoly. It's just, you've got to get a lead piping in the library kind of thing.
So taking that as an example, which is sort of the rules of the game, if you like, is that as either educators or educators of educators or developers of educators, is that a sort of interesting topic area? The kind of I'm trying to form a question around, I think, inclusivity and opening up the black box of higher education. Do we need to do more work there, or is it that we need to change the assessment, or it's a bit of both, isn't it?
It's a bit of both. I think that inclusivity is, everyone's, you asked earlier about, what's kind of latest. We're talking about inclusivity all the time. It's been around for a number of years. The Office for Students and the Access Participation Plans are foregrounding in institutional minds. And it's a great lever for talking about creating the enabling conditions around teaching and learning for all, and making the tacit explicit and all that.
Yeah.
And I think it is a really important part, but no one naturally is going to say they're an exclusive teacher, though.
No.
So how do you tackle the question about who your teaching and learning is for without, because no one's going to put their hand up and say, no, my teaching and learning isn't for these people. So it's quite clunky to go in, I think, sometimes with it. How inclusive is my assessment? So ask questions which are more like, what kind of behaviours, what kind of support do students need to be successful in this assessment? What are the kind of environment you need to support with the students in the lecture, in the office hours, whatever it is, for the student to do the type of thinking, rather than measuring how inclusive. You've come over 7 out of 10, your assessment's inclusive. We can't have a hard number to creating a culture and an environment. But we don't ask those questions. I think we ask, come in at the other end for me.
I think that might have been an aspect of my question earlier about, when I said, are we over-reliant on assessment? I think at the back of my mind, there was something about, are we over-reliant on the quantitative aspect of assessment and this need to assign a numerical value to everyone's learning? I mean, it seems to be the default mode for most assessments.
A grade, you mean a number?
A grade, albeit, there's a huge drive for qualitative feedback, and we know the importance of feedback on learning and guided feedback and everything else. But ultimately, the number is always there. And I think there has been, you guys probably talk about this more than I would know, but there has been a fair amount of research to say that the grade can be counterproductive in some situations.
Yeah, there is stuff, isn't there, about, saying give feedback without marks, students will engage in the feedback. I think it's our lived reality, isn't it, though? Assigning some kind of outcome, whether it's numerical or word. I think that's the bit where we have to be a bit practical about what the purpose of HE is. We are accountable to every taxpayer in the country.
Yeah. And that's not a bad thing, actually, having accountability in higher education.
So for me, that's not a bad thing. But numerical grading, percentage grading, I think it's the most unhelpful thing we've done. Yeah, I think we set up a sense of linearity between the 68 and the 7. What 2 more things do I need to do?
Yeah.
When you'll probably say it's qualitatively different getting a 2-1 to getting a first. But we don't set it up like that. We set it up as what 2 things?
Okay, so it's about that holistic judgment versus numbers on a,
And we spend a lot of time making
agonising over
between a 68 and a 66, where, quite frankly, that's not a good use of anyone's time.
Yeah, and the impact on the learner, the person receiving the feedback, can be completely out of proportion to the intention of. So, as a marker, perhaps we have to land on a particular grade, or sometimes a particular side of a grade boundary, and we might do so casually. Think, okay, so 68, but the impact on the learner might be.
It'd be huge because it's culturally contextualised, isn't it?
Yeah.
So if you work in North American institutions, so when I worked in Queen's University in Canada, when I first did some marking, they told me just to add 15 on to my British marking. And I arrived at the same outcomes. And it shows how it's not really an objective, no matter how clear your criteria are. There's a social construction around what good looks like in marking. So a fail mark in the North American system was 50%.
Wow.
And here it's 40 or 50 masters.
Yeah.
But also then you get things like habits, which should be challenged more through SoTL, about we never give over 70.
Yeah, we don't use the full grade bundle.
Well, then if you don't give
can't.
over 70, make 70 your 100.
Yeah.
It's this kind of ludicrous, really. So, there's a lot of things around our, in terms of SoTL, isn't always about inquiring into students' learning. It's about inquiring into teaching practices and behaviours. I think we should be doing far more work. And I think the recent marking and assessment boycott has challenged some institutions to think about different ways to think about marking. And I think that the question, going back, what are the good questions to be asked, is there's an assumption made that some marking practices are better than others. And we're constantly being asked to defend and say, why? Tell me how this assessment is as good as this one. How is this as good as a lecture? And we have these kind of mythical gold standards of higher education. The closed book exam, the lecture, these are, how is anything else you do in teaching and assessment as good as this?
This is important, I think, because it's actually also coming back to another point that we talked about earlier, which is around challenging those sort of assumptions. And how can we as SoTL practitioners or burgeoning SoTL practitioners find courage to do that? And again, another big question. If you can just solve that for us in 10 easy sentences.
Courage, excellent.
But,
10,
What can sustain us in doing that, and how practically can we
you have to networks. It's your network. You have to be sharing this stuff. And I think there's got to be space for I tried this and it didn't work. And I think it's almost embracing failure. I mean, you want your students to take risks. You want your students to say, we learn when we fall over. You learn when you fall over in teaching as well. And being more honest more quickly with peers about something that's sticky, not working, not quite that good. So I think it's creating those kind of groups around you and networks. Honesty and transparency. There's far too many conferences where everything worked.
It's not a clear picture, is it, of the
it's
reality?
Never like that.
And that's really problematic then if you come from practice and you want to enter into this community and it feels like the community is saying, or there's bits of it that it's all right when you're thinking on your own practice. It's not. That went like a lead balloon last week.
And expect your first couple of kind of more formal teaching inquiries to not go well.
Yeah.
And you're an apprentice learning a new skill set and new methodologies. You're going to ask the wrong questions in your surveys. You're going to analyse your data incorrectly. Of course you are.
So is that a point where, I know we're running up against the clock now, so I'll try and no, this won't be a concise question. What am I talking about? Right. So just
what have you got?
Before you were, I wanted to pick up on a couple of things that you were both saying before we turned the mics on, which was you're talking about the importance of the peer review process and publication. Is that what you? It sounded like a conversation that you were chatting about before. So is there an argument that one of the shortcomings of doing that without the auxiliary conversational aspects and the social learning? Because just now you were highlighting the importance of the social aspects of sharing your practice, which I totally agree with. But if you're just dependent on the publication as your means of communication, do you miss that level of scrutiny, which people asking you questions, kind of like what we're doing now, where you're having the spontaneous discussion and you kind of have to justify a belief that, and sometimes the speed of the conversation makes you realize, oh, actually, I don't have a really strong justification for that. That's a good point. And you incrementally change your mind through the course of a conversation. So I think that's why things like more dialogical media of scholarship of teaching and learning are so helpful and so valuable. That's not to preclude.
Peer review article is that. It's just a slower conversation, isn't it?
But it's also the end of a process as well. So it's part of it. So I think if what you're saying is that when I was doing my materials research, the things you think about what people do, you present ideas quite rawly at conference. You take a hit sometimes, or you get some feedback. You can say, I tried this, it didn't work. You might do that in departmental presentations with your peers. And the ideas tend to be rawer. And I think we don't present very raw ideas in teaching and learning. And I think that's the bit that's really important, to create that dialogue. But we shouldn't be afraid of going to that more public, more formal peer review process and opening ourselves up and wanting to get that critical feedback and not seeing it as a challenge. I think there's a danger slightly in SoTL and calling everything SoTL is that because we're so happy people are interested in teaching We want to call it scholarship of teaching and learning. I think SoTL should put its walls up a bit more and saying, that's great, and I'm really pleased that you're interested in teaching, and I'm really pleased you've read some stuff. But SoTL is deliberate, purposeful inquiry, and not to muddy the waters between those two.
And there's a value in that.
And if you
dilute it, it will lose its value, some of that.
And scholars are talking about the dilution of SoTL. It's become this broad church, and everyone's we're all happy or doing it. Distinguish. And call it something.
Yeah, and I think that's really important here at York as well, where we, the research article, the scholarship, or a published piece is a currency of academics.
It's academic currency the world over.
And there's a reason for that, and a kind of set of standards that go with that, and that's okay. In fact, I really value that. I think it's important. If we do dilute that, we lose something really, really important, and we lose that for learners too. That's our culture as practitioners, isn't it? For good reason, some of it.
It's not just doing that. You go out and you give presentations, and give talks. You do podcasts, So I think it's recommend, but also getting people who are subject experts and in disciplinary research. They're doing all this, but and that's going into the pot of kind of informing them. The publication is one thing, and I think too quickly SoTL tried to say it's not about publication. I think it should be. I want to put it back on the table.
Yeah, definitely. And just my question was about, should it be just publication? I don't think, because I find it really I like the writing process. If you're writing for something which you hope might get published, it's just putting your work under a different kind of microscope, and it is really valuable. Because at times I thought, I've got a great idea for an article, and you start writing, and you get into it, and you realise, actually, I don't have anything that new or interesting to say, because it forces you to explore certain reading avenues, and it forces you to think your ideas through a microscopic level, and to put everything down into coherent sentences that all hang together. And it's at that point that you realise that actually you had maybe a bit of a cherished belief that doesn't quite bear scrutiny. So I really think
that
it's valuable.
Process as well is you talked to earlier a little bit about the difference between, what was it, being something and doing something.
Critical thinking and critical being.
Yeah. So that process of being engaged in the constant sort of analysis, and that it's not done, which is sometimes, again, a bit overwhelming, but it's also why it's interesting, because you don't stop that process once you've published an article. You then, or done a podcast or whatever, it's kind of continual habits, isn't it?
So before we all turn into pumpkins, because it is past 12 o'clock, Lucy, did you have any of your questions here that we are going to kick ourselves for not asking? We could just do a quick fire.
Yeah, Jane.
Not how to succeed.
Well, there is one which we've touched on, but I'd really like to finish on it, which is about working collaboratively, I think, with scholarship. We talked about conversations, and I suppose just closing on that, what networks can we get involved in? How can we make sure our practice is collaborative, and what does that look like for us?
That's a small question again, isn't it? Quite frankly. It comes back to something I think we were talking about earlier as well, is you can be collaborative also by making sure you're talking to people across subject areas, across institutions, finding those opportunities, connecting through different social media. I find Twitter has been the most important thing in the last 3 or 4 years for me, to stay connected quickly and rapidly to the latest thinking and asking questions. But we're talking about publications just now. They're great, but there's a time lag. And you see a lot of early prints and early ideas. So doing that, and you also speak to people you wouldn't normally speak to. Not just looking and reading and speaking to people in your own subject. Go and talk to the people across the corridor. Go and talk to people across the university. I mean, the university is the ultimate place to kind of meet people out of your discipline, but go and talk to other institutions. Make sure you're stepping out. And we talked a bit about kind of the politics of paying attention to the landscape of higher education in the UK. I think people need to connect themselves into the kind of the debates around learning and teaching HE, freedom of speech conversation. It matters.
But in the wider context.
What the Office for Students is saying about access and participation. Tap yourself into that. Love it or hate it, the Teaching Excellence Framework. These are things that are happening for us in the UK. Stay connected, talk, but be open to listening as well.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much.
That's fantastic.
Thank you for taking the time to come and talk to us. It's been really great. And we've
thank you, Jane.
dragged you around in unexpected directions, but it's been really educational. So thank you very much.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you.
If you get anything useful out of that, good luck.